Hi there, welcome to Microsoft Azure training series. My name is Neeraj Kumar. I am a cloud evangelist and enterprise architect, and I will be your instructor for this course. So most of you must have already heard about the VNet integration or the regional VNet integration. And today I'm going to explain with an example of why is VNet integration required for the app services, and that too with private endpoints. So if you're not aware of what a private endpoint is, there is a URL that appears on the top right corner in the notification, and you can visit my previous video where I have briefly touched upon what the private endpoints or the private links are and how do they help. So in case you're not aware, just go visit that video and you will understand what the private endpoints are and how do they help. But just a sneak peek why the private endpoints are used, it is to isolate your app from the internet. So configuring a private endpoint with your app, you can securely host line of business applications and other intranet applications which you do not want to be accessed from the public internet. So that is one benefit of it. The other one is that it prevents the data exfiltration. And since the private endpoints only goes to one app, you don't need to worry about the data exfiltration situations as well. Okay, and this, when I say that the private endpoint only goes to one app, I'll show you with an example. And then there may be questions on why use the private link or the private endpoints instead of using the service endpoints, and why not use the app services environment if you want to have it within the virtual network. So there are certain differences which you should be aware of while making a decision as to go with the private endpoints or to go with the service endpoints or to go with the app services environments. So when I talk about the service endpoints, they enable you to secure your app to select set of subnets, right? And it is used to secure the service to only being reachable from the selected subnets. When we talk about the private link, it exposes your app on an address in your VNet and removes it from the public access. So what it means is, if you are connected to your virtual network using the point-to-site VPN or a site-to-site VPN, in that case, you can access it from your local on-premises environment. And that is the difference. That is one of the major differences that you see between the private endpoints and the service endpoints. Now, talking about the private endpoints or the private link with the app services environment, what is the difference? When we talk about the app services environment, if you're using the ILB ASE, you have single tenant system that can have many apps behind one VNet address. And as I already mentioned about the private endpoints, there is one address with one app. So there is a complete separation of concerns as well. So those are the major differences. Now, when we talk about the VNet integration and putting your app in your VNet, how does that help? When the app services uses the private endpoint, it only secures the inbound connections, and you can make inbound calls to the app services. The outbound calls are not allowed. So in order for the outbound calls to be happening, there are two things you need to do. One, for the inbound, you need to use the private endpoint, and for the outbound calls, you need to put your app services, which uses the private endpoint, you need to put it in the VNet. And how do you do that? You do it with the VNet integration. Let me show you my current environment. So I am on my Azure portal currently, as you see. The first thing I'm going to do is to show you the virtual network. So here is my virtual network, which is ATCSL VNet. It is an address range of 10.0.0.0/16. And then I have different subnets here. I'll go to the subnets directly. So one of the subnets that I have created here is the subnets for the VM, which is SNet-VMs. Then we have the SNet-PTE. This subnet is for the private endpoints. I've created a separate subnet for them. And then I have a gateway subnet. Now this gateway subnet is used when you are creating the virtual network gateway for site-to-site connection or the point-to-site connection. Okay. There are other subnets as well, like SNet app you see here, or the ADDS subnet. I'm not going to explain right now. Just wait for a while and we will definitely return to this. So this is all about the virtual network. Other than that, I also have virtual machines. So I have created one virtual machine, which is VM1, and it is running in the East US region. And if I click on this, it has a public IP as well as a private IP address. And that's it about the virtual machines. We now come to the virtual network gateways. So I've already configured these virtual network gateways and created the point-to-site connectivity because this usually takes a lot of time. So I have pre-created them. If I click on the virtual network gateways, it will show me the details. The SKU that I have is VPN GW2. And this VPN is route-based. It uses the same virtual network, which is ATCSL VNet with a public IP address, of course. So if I go to point-to-site configuration, if I click on it, I have given the address pool here. So 172.16.0.0/24 is the subnet CIDR, any system connecting to the Azure virtual network that we have created. One of the IP addresses from this range will be allocated to that particular system. Now, moving back to the search, and here I will click on the app services. Now, if we talk about the app services, I created this app services with the name of ATCSL app. If you look at the app service plan, it is P1V2. Now, just 30 seconds to talk about it. If we talk about the private endpoints to be used with this app services web app, we need to have the SKU chosen as Premium V2. So I chose Premium V2 and this is P1 V2. So make sure that the SKU, you changed it from the basic or a standard to Premium 2. Okay, so this is there. And then if I go down here a little, I don't have any custom domains. There is nothing as such. If I go to networking, I have the private endpoint connections here. Now, if I click on configure your private endpoint connections, I see that I have a connection which is named as PTE app services ATCSL app and then a GUID associated with it. The connection state is showing to be approved, and the private endpoint we have as PTE-app service-ATCSL app. That is a name that I gave to this particular private endpoint. And then you can click on the private endpoint name. And here you will see that it is already approved, and the target sub-resource is site, which goes to ATCSL app, right? And if you scroll down, you will see that ATCSL app.azurewebsites.net, which is the internal domain name which Microsoft automatically associates with the newly created app services web app. So it is already there. And then you have the private IP address of 10.0.1.4, right? So this is already there. Now, if I try to go back to ATCSL app, scroll up, go to overview, and now if I click on the URL here, it says error 403 forbidden because I'm not connected to my Azure VNet using the point-to-site VPN. I'm not connected via the VPN client. And this means that I'm still trying to access this application from the public internet. And that is why I get an error 403 forbidden. Now, let us try to connect again with the VPN client. So I'll click on connect and then click on connect again and then click on yes. So it will take a couple of seconds and then it will connect me through the VPN client to Azure virtual network that we had created earlier. So this is done. So I'll minimize this and I'll try to refresh this page. And there you go. I now have a working application. And how you can validate that? Simple. You can just click on the search button, type in CMD, and then within the command prompt, what you can do is you can simply write nslookup and then give the name of the application. In our case, it is etcsl-app.azurewebsites.net. So I'll simply copy this, go back here, paste it, and remove the slashes and https:/. So I've removed this, I'll hit enter, and there you go. The final destination for this app shows to be 10.0.1.4. And if you notice one more thing, you see another server address which is 10.0.3.4. Just make sure that I explain it to you, okay? Now, one other thing, guys, when you are using the private endpoint, you need to have a forwarder for the IP address. In case you do not have an IP forwarder, it will not work. I told you to remind me about the address space, right? Which is 10.0.3.4. This is the IP address of the Azure AD domain services that I had configured in my environment. And now I'll show you that. So if I click on it and if I go to Azure AD domain services, I will see that I already have the kurari.com. There are multiple ways to have the forwarding enabled. First of all, understand that when you're creating an app services web app, you get a default domain preceded with the application name that you gave. In my case, it was etcsl. So I got etcsl-app.azurewebsites.net. etcsl app being the name of the application that I gave. That is behind a private IP address. And for it to be working from on-premises using the site-to-site or a point-to-site, I need to have a forwarder for this particular IP address. And this can be done in multiple ways. One, you can have a virtual machine set up with the DNS ability. You can either have a Windows virtual machine and then configure the DNS role and then have the forwarder to this particular IP address. Or you can also have the private link, and for that also you need to have a forwarder and the private link to work. In my case, I have the Azure AD domain services. If we try to access without the forwarder, the request for your app.azurewebsites.net will although go to the Azure DNS server, which is again 168 dot blah 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 blah, and then it will try to find out the route to the private IP address, and that will not work. It will fail always. So that is the reason you need a forwarder. In my case, instead of having a virtual machine set up with the DNS ability, the other way around for me was to have the Azure AD domain services installed. So I will click on kurari.com and we will look at the details. Guys, one thing, this Azure AD domain services needs a separate session altogether because it's a huge topic in itself. But just so as to show you what we have here, if you see, I have IP addresses of 10.0.3.4 and 10.0.3.5. These are the two DNS servers with two different IP addresses assigned to them. And if you look at the virtual network / subnets, this one, you will see that this is under the AADDS-subnet, the Azure AD Domain Services subnet. And that is the one that you saw earlier, and I said I'll show it to you later on. So this is the one subnet where these two IP addresses are assigned from. Okay, and if I search for ADDS and search for the public IP addresses, I see that there is a public IP address which is this one, the first one. If I click on this, you will see a public IP address of 52.247.21.15. That is the public IP addresses, and this public IP address is for the load balancer. So, and that load balancer has the backend addresses as the two private IP addresses that I had shown earlier. What you can also do is you can search for the load balancer, click on this, and you will see the same thing. This load balancer, if you click on it, you will see the front-end IP configuration and the backend pools. So click on the front-end IP configurations. You see the same thing. And for the backend pools, just click on it and you will see 3.4 and 3.5. So now hopefully it will make more sense to you of how the Azure AD domain service works with the public IP address request coming to it, and then it is forwarding it to the private IP addresses 3.4 and 3.5. And since 3.4 and 3.5 are within the same virtual network as a private endpoint, and it knows where to go, and that is how the request is forwarded to 10.0.1.4, that is the private IP address of the Azure App Services web app. So we have the default page which is up and running for now, but I want a custom application. So here is the scenario. I have an App Services web app that wishes to talk to the Web Services API that is already configured on one of the virtual machines that I had shown earlier, right? And my App Services web app wants to interact and gets the result back. So I have created a simple solution. So I will open the Visual Studio for you. So here you go. I'll just minimize that. I've already published, but I'll show you again. So here is the code. I have a simple solution where I have two projects. One is the sample web application and the other one is the web service app. So we'll talk about the web service app first. So I'll go to asmx.cs. Here I have four different methods, which are add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And what they do is they just return the result of the two numbers which were passed as parameters. Okay. Now going back to the sample web application, if I click on home.aspx.cs, before looking at the code, let me show you the interface. So here we have the interface where I have two text boxes where I can enter two numbers and then click on add button, and the result will be displayed in the label. Now going back to home.aspx.cs, if you see here, it is just making the object and then calling the add method from that web service. And what it is doing is it is passing the value of the two text boxes. And finally, whatever result we are getting back, it is printing it as the result. So the result is whatever has been returned. So it's very simple. So before publishing or before moving on to Azure, I'll just right click it, set this as the startup project, and just try to debug it from here. So if I pass on say 7 and then here 8 and then click add, the result is 15. So one more time. So if I give here 6 and I give here 5 and click on add, the result is 11. It's as simple as that. Okay. What I'll do is I'll just close this, and this code, I have already published it to my App Services web app. So I'll show you how I did it. So I'll right click on it, click on publish here. I already have the ATCSL app. So I just clicked on publish. If you don't have it, it will start like this. So you just click on start and select existing from the Azure App Service because you already have that App Services web app, and then you can click on create profile. And here, after you have successfully logged in and you are on this screen, you will see the apps that are already present, and you can select it and then click on OK. So that is how the connection was earlier made, and I published the code. For the web services app, I just went ahead, build it, and copy pasted the code on the VM. So I'll show you that. So I'll just do an RDP and I'll click on connect. Notice here that I am connecting this using the private IP address because I'm already connected via the point to site VPN. So I'm on this machine, and here one thing I have done is I have already configured the IIS role, and under the default website I have already configured the application. So if I if I click on browse, you will see the same methods that I was displaying earlier. So there is an add method, divide, multiply, and subtract. It functions exactly the same thing because the same code, of course. So this is what it is. And I want to call it from my app services web app. Okay. So if I minimize this virtual machine and go back to my Azure portal, I will click on the app services, click on ADCSL app, and then click on ADCSL app.azurewebsites.net. Here it shows the default page. Why? Because I had home.aspx, if you remember, and home.aspx is not the default page. So what you can do, you can add home.aspx in the configurations for the default pages, but I've not done that. So I'll just click on slash and then type in home.aspx and click on enter. And now you see the same interface that appears. What do you expect the result will be? I will just enter the same value, 7 and 8, and click on add. So what do you think the result should be? It should be 15, right? No, it's a runtime error. And why is that so? Why is it not able to communicate with the web services on the virtual machine? Because I already told you that when you have the private endpoint configured, it will only securely allow the inbound calls to the app services web app. The outbound calls are not allowed. And that is where you need to have the VNet integration. And even before that, one more thing that I wanted to tell you is that if you go to networking and then click on your private endpoint, you will see an IP address which is 10.0.1.4 assigned to this particular app. And that is another one that I was explaining, that each app gets their own IP address. It's not that all the apps are behind one IP address or one address. Each app gets its own IP address. Okay. So now going back to the app, here I have the VNet integration under networking, just above the private endpoint connections. So I'll click here to configure, and then I need to add the VNet. I'll click on add VNet, and from the virtual network, I will choose the same thing, ATCSL VNet East US2, the one that I already had. And then I can either create a new subnet or I can select an existing subnet, and there is a gateway subnet as well, right? For now that we need to integrate it with the VNet that we already have, I can just go ahead and select the SNet app. This is the one that I created just before doing this demo, just to make sure everything is working. So I created this subnet. So I can use the same subnet, or in your case, you can just go ahead and create a new subnet. Once that is done, you can click on OK. And that's it. So we already have the VNet integration. If you scroll down, it says the start address of that virtual network address space is 0.0 and ends in 255.255. And for the subnet address space, it starts from 4.0 until 4.255. That's the address space in which we currently have this app. Okay, so now that the VNet integration is done, we know that it will allow both inbound and outbound access as well. Although it will work, but just to make sure, I'll stop the service, wait for a couple of seconds, and then start the service again. By this, we are making sure that the VNet integration is properly propagated. So once we are done, we'll click on ATCSL app.azurewebsites.net. It's still working. And then I'll click slash, type in home.aspx. There you go. And I will enter the two numbers and click on add. And voila, here you go. The result is 15. It shows the correct message. It is able to access the web services which was deployed in the virtual machine. And now the web app is securely make outbound calls and it is able to communicate with the web services. So we'll do a quick test one more time. So 6 and 5, the same numbers that we did on the local VM. I'll click on this and there you go. You have the result as 11. So this service is now perfectly working. And now you see that why this VNet integration makes sense, right? So this is just one example of VNet integration. The VNet peering, the VNet integration, those are required when you want the resources to access each other within the same or different VNets in the same or different regions. So there can be VNets in different regions and you want to access the resources there, or you want the resources in that particular VNet to access the resources that are here in your VNet, then you just do a regional VNet integration or the VNet peering and your task will be done. And that is where the VNet integration comes into picture. I hope I was able to explain it to you. The usage of VNet integration or the regional VNet integration in case where you have the app services web app behind the private endpoint. So thank you, dear friends. And if you like the video, just give us a thumbs up. And in case it is possible, just click on the subscribe button so that I could bring you more such tips and tricks which are used by the Azure administrators on a daily basis, or which are used by the architects even when they are planning or architecting the infrastructure or the solution for the corporates. So thank you so much. Until we meet next time, keep Azuring.